Okay, we're going to now move tack into our second session. Members of the BVA certainly, and people within the profession and without will not fail to have noticed that BVA has campaigned for a number of years to improve the welfare of animals at slaughter, and this campaign has increased in its visibility and media coverage over the last sort of 24 months. As we've called for a ban and a very successful e-petition reaching almost 120,000 signatures of members of the public, which have taken that debate forward and indeed had it discussed at the highest level. But whilst we look for balancing up supply and demand and looking at labelling of product to improve consumer choice, we also recognise that we need to look at further ways of actually refining the technique at slaughter so that we can perhaps embrace new techniques of stunning that is acceptable to those communities that require them within their religious laws, and also refinement to look at immediate post-cut stunning. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Steve Wotton to the lectern. Steve is a researcher who's currently working on practical evidence-based ways to improve the stunning process. So, Steve, thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to come. If you were to ask vet students, fifth-year vet students, are you interested in welfare at stunning and slaughter? The answer would be no. Yet, last year's forum, the most requested topic was welfare at stunning and slaughter. Now, the only reason I can think for that was the fact that I didn't give a talk last year. But let's see where we can go with this year. I'm going to finish with a bit about slaughter without stunning. I don't want to talk endlessly about that subject because we can go round in circles. So I'm going to start by looking at stunning. And stunning is, in my book, immediate loss of consciousness which lasts until death, which is the WASC, the Welfare of Animals Slaughter or Killing definition, which is a really nice definition. We know what immediate is, we know what consciousness is, although it's difficult to measure, and we certainly know what death is. The new regulation that's come out on the 1st of January 2013 from Brussels, although it's not implemented in England yet, it is in the other 3 parts of the UK, requires a slightly different interpretation. Any intentionally induced process which causes loss of consciousness and sensibility without pain. And they call that simple stunning because the animal would recover, and they go on to say, including any process resulting in instantaneous death. That used to be killing under the old regulation. They've now included it together. Now, there are various ways we can carry out this process of stunning under that definition. For instance, we can use a mechanical process, and methods have been developed for poultry, particularly for casualty slaughter on farm, where you can carry out a percussive blow to the head that will produce instantaneous death. And those devices are at use in British farms. Research is trying to take that another stage and produce something that would be useful for, say, poultry growers, for chicken growers, rather than necking birds, which has been found to be inhumane. We'd like to promote a tool that they could use. And working with Webley Scott, we've got a latest prototype that we're testing at the moment, which is a spring-powered device, again, which would deliver a physical blow and kill the bird immediately, instantly. So we've got some developments in the UK. If you go to the States, then there are more fanciful tools, and they look much better, of course. But they're doing the same purpose. They're delivering a known blow to the head of the animal, which will result in instantaneous death. And again, this device is powered on a butane cylinder, and one small butane cylinder will give you 1,000 shots, totally portable. We've evaluated an air-powered device made by the same company on anaesthetized piglets up to 10 kilos, using visual evoked potentials to look at cortical function, and we found that it's very effective up to about 7 or 8 kilos. So for neonates, these sort of tools are a way around the problem of casualty slaughter on farm, and they're humane. But what about the mechanical devices we use in slaughterhouses? They've been around for years, and they've not improved in any way. Very little investment by the manufacturers, or very little research into ways of carrying it forward, but perhaps this American manufacturer may stimulate the UK manufacturers to do something. So if we take a British gun, cowpuncher as it is, we could measure the velocity. That would be reasonably easily, because you've got a steel bolt traveling down a barrel, you can simply measure the velocity using a solenoid valve, for instance. And if we were then to use something like Bluetooth, we could then receive that information on a tablet or on a phone and record the velocity produced by each shot in vivo, and tell the slaughterman whether he's delivered the right energy or not. And of course, over time, you could plot whether the gun is losing efficiency, whether it's wearing out, whether he should change it, get it serviced, etc. Much more information. And we've got a project proposal in on this. Whether it's a tablet or a phone, we're not sure yet. But obviously, we have to record. Part of the new regulations is all about recording. It's all about SOPs and recording data. So, possible way forward. What about electricity? We can use electricity to stun animals. Research has shown that as you apply electrical current to an animal, as you increase the voltage, you can see there is a reduction in the resistance there, and that's brought about by an effect that living tissue has. In effect, the voltage is breaking a low resistance route through the tissue. And once that's achieved, it remains there for quite some time, post-slaughter, for instance. So we need to apply sufficient voltage to break down that resistance to ensure that the animal is stunned immediately. And if we look at the sort of currents necessary, say at 50 hertz, we can see that with pigs, if we want to deliver 1.3 amps, the horizontal line, to do that, we need 250 volts or more. And that will break down the inherent high resistance to deliver sufficient current within the timescale of 0.2 of a second. And I'll explain 0.2 of a second in a minute. Now, one of the problems of electrical stunning is it doesn't just stimulate the brain. It stimulates lots of other things and creates meat quality problems. So you can get blood splash, hemorrhaging within the muscle, you can get broken bones, which obviously devalues the carcass, and therefore abattoirs are looking to improve the stunning system in terms of meat quality. So they'll quite often go to higher frequencies because that does less direct muscle stimulation and produces less damage. If you go to higher frequencies here at 1500 hertz, you require higher voltages to deliver the current. And this is a factor of living tissue again. So we have to understand what we're applying and the effects it has on the animal. So, can we set up some criteria? I mean, you're veterinarians, the majority of the audience are veterinarians. You can use animal-based approaches. You can look at the animal. But can we have, say, an electrical approach to this? Can we say that if you can deliver sufficient current within a certain time, you're almost certainly guaranteed to stun that animal if it's applied in the right place? And the answer is, I think you can. So I would come up with this criteria. Successful electrical stunning requires a minimum of, say, 1.3 amps in pigs. We know that. We know that 1 amp applied for less than 0.2 of a second, and that's where the 0.2 of a second came in sheep, will not produce epilepsy in the brain. And that's the stunned state we're looking for. So you've got to apply at least that amount of current for that amount of time to produce the action on the brain. Therefore, the criteria for an immediate stun based on electrical criteria is 1.3 amps within 200 milliseconds, hence the line on the graph. So from an electrical viewpoint, we can predict from what we're delivering to the animal whether we can stun it effectively or not. And that's very important to do so. For sheep, well, we need 1 amp, slightly less current, and the same criteria, 200 milliseconds. Now, you could say, well, what's going on within the first 200 milliseconds? Because we know that an animal can feel pain within, say, 100, 150 milliseconds. And the answer is, of course, that that amount of current is going to disrupt neural membranes during the application before you get to the stimulation that produces the epilepsy. So the brain's not going to be working. The animal won't feel it, so it's effective stunning. We can measure this, the waveforms, current profiles on equipment that is required in the legislation. So this is a system that I was involved in the development of, which is a really useful one because it expands that 200 milliseconds at the front edge. It costs a few quid. I'm afraid that's the problem, particularly with small throughput plants. But you have to measure it in some way. And if you look at the screen of this device, it will give you, during the first 200 milliseconds here, you can see the current profile. And I'm looking for it to get above the 1.3 amps, if this is for pigs, within that time scale. And then what happens thereafter, I'm not concerned. The animal's stunned. If there's breaks in contact and it falls below that level, well, it's not that important from a welfare point of view. Extending the time period won't extend the period the animal's stunned, nor extending the voltage and current applied. Once you've got to 1.3 amps for 200 milliseconds, just beyond, the animal's epileptic, unconscious. So, if you look at a more recently developed stunner, which is constant current, you can see that the current level gets up there really quickly, and then electronic control keeps the level at the 1 or 1.3 amps required. This is one for sheep. So the more modern equipment allows you to apply just the right amount of current. Not too much, so you can reduce the damage done in terms of meat quality and carcass quality, but enough to ensure that you stun. So we are making some serious advances here. And if you combine this sort of current profile monitoring with, say, CCTV, and if you, for instance, with CCTV, you do have problems with, well, how are you going to monitor it? There are ways of doing that. How often? You can base the frequency on perhaps the stun assurance monitor results, and why not picture-in-picture the stun assurance results with the CCTV, so you can see the position the electrodes are applied to the animal, as well as the current that's delivered. Then if you get any problems, you can go and troubleshoot. It's really easy. So there's been some serious advances. So some of the comments, some of the feedback that we get from some of the religious groups that John mentioned earlier about stunning is not very effective. I'm sorry, it's getting very effective. And we've got the evidence to prove it. So, more and more plants have got CCTV. It's a requirement from Freedom Foods and other retailers as well. So, what do we see in the laboratory? Well, we can measure EEG, and the left-hand panel will show you an EEG from a pig, and then you see this epileptic activity, high amplitude, low frequency activity produced by the electrical stun. And as long as that fit is going on in the brain, the animal's unconscious, through analogy with human tonic-clonic epilepsy. We can measure it. Very easy to measure in the laboratory, very difficult to measure in the abattoir. But we can take the signs, symptoms that the animal displays and then do something with that. Translate that in the abattoir situation. And when the fit ends, the animal resumes rhythmic breathing, the first signs of recovery in that situation. So, if we were to look at that, particularly here, we've got one for poultry. We can see we've got a stun here, pre-stun value, then it's stunned, and then we've got some polyspike activity, particularly here, followed by EEG suppression. And those are the criteria we're looking for. If you analyze that in terms of fast FFT, you can see that starting with, if we look at 100% of the change in area under the curve, we can see that it goes down to below 10%, stays down there for a while before recovery. So we can analyze the EEG in lots of different ways these days. Computer programs allow us to do that. So using those criteria in the laboratory, we now know that the occurrence of epileptiform activity in the EEGs following stunning determined subjectively at first by examining EEG traces, followed by this reduction in total power content to less than 10%. Pre-stun levels indicate quiescent or flat EEG for a period, suppression for a period, and that indicates effective stunning. So from a scientific point of view, there's generalized agreement throughout the world now about how we can analyze brain activity from stunned birds and stunned animals. But of course, it's quite different to actually do that in an abattoir situation when you're trying to really assess each animal that's stunned effectively. And that's the job of the slaughterman. He's got to assess every single animal. The animal welfare officer, who I'll talk about later, has got to assess a subset, maybe 10%. And the OV has got to, again, assess a subset. But the slaughterman's got to evaluate every animal. So how can he do it? Well, he's going to look for a tonic phase, first of all, that the animal would display as soon as the electrodes are applied, whether it's stunned or not. It will go tonic, front legs extended, hind legs flexed into the body, followed by a clonic phase, uncontrolled physical activity. And the 37 seconds is the minimum time seen with pigs to return to rhythmic breathing. So there's quite a lot of experimental evidence as to the signs that we can use in an abattoir situation. But it is quite difficult to do because of the convulsions, the kicking. This uncontrolled physical activity can be very severe, particularly in pigs. So here we've got a Jarvis beef stunner. It's applying current to cattle, firstly to the head through a nose application to the neck. Then the second cycle is from the nose to a brisket application to stop the heart. And then the third is the spinal discharge cycle from the nose to somewhere on the back of the box where the animal makes contact. This device was developed in New Zealand. And in New Zealand, they use it for halal, because they don't apply the cardiac arrest cycle. But here, we can't do that. Because if you only apply the head cycle, the animal would roll out, and the physical convulsions would make it very difficult to do anything else. In New Zealand, they use low voltage immobilization to keep the animal still while they make the cuts and during the first period of bleeding. Of course, that's prohibited in Europe because you can't then assess whether the animal's stunned or recovering or not. So that doesn't really work. We need something else. The times that they sort of used for those applications and the current supplied are shown there. So it's 3.5 amps for the head-only cycle, cardiac arrest 3 amps, and then spinal discharge 3.2. Minimum current required based on research is shown next. Anything more than 1.15 is enough to take brain out. Heart requires a bit more, and we're not really interested in spinal discharge. So we've measured what it does. We know the electrical parameters, but we still get occasional problems with, if we do a head-only stun, we're going to get kicking. So you can't use that for halal. You've got to use the cardiac arrest cycle with the Jarvis beef stun in Europe. So are there any other alternatives? Well, maybe. In a recent publication in Australia, some researchers have looked at the use of a very high amplitude pulse. You can almost consider this as lightning, applied head-only to cattle. And what they found is that this produces a stun not through the generation of epilepsy, but through the disruption of neural membranes, a bit like electropoiesis. And these animals are recoverable. So they were able to apply a single or a double pulse. They were unconscious for about 4 minutes, no kicking, no movement, and recovered. Very interesting. The Humane Slaughter Association have funded a PhD study that's just starting at the University of Bristol, and we will be looking at how we can develop this for really stunning all animals, but particularly for religious slaughter, for those religions that will allow stunning prior to slaughter. Potentially interesting. Another area where research is going on, again, down under, is to use microwaves, both for cattle and sheep. A few problems with skin burns, but they're able to show that it's got potential. That's a subject area that I looked at quite a long time ago, and at the time, where there was focused microwaves, it wasn't really a very useful way of doing it. But with unfocused microwaves, they've got more chance. So they're looking at producing either some seizures within the brain, which again would produce some form of kicking or convulsions, or simply raising the temperature of the brain enough to take the brain out. So an interesting area. Poultry, well, poultry are difficult, because poultry respond differently to electrical stunning systems, perhaps, and to other systems. In the new regulations, they make this statement. They really would have liked to have banned water bath stunning of poultry. But they found they couldn't do it because it would have cost the industry too much money. So, what could they do instead? What can we do instead of water bath stunning? The real problem with water bath stunning is that you can't control the currents through individual birds. And I'll demonstrate this fairly quickly. It may be a while since you did any physics, but let's have a quick look at this. If you look at the range in resistances through individual chickens in a water bath stunner, it's going to range something like that, okay? From, say, 1,000 ohms up to 2,500 ohms. We want 100 milliamps per bird because we're going at low frequency with this, so we want a total of 400 milliamps. How can you calculate the voltage required? Well, you have to calculate the total resistance by 1 over total resistance equals 1 over bird 1, 1 over bird 2 plus 1 over bird 3, etc. It comes out to 390 ohms in this situation. Therefore, you want a voltage of 156 volts. Now, the problem then occurs, of course, is that current will flow down the path of least resistance. So the current through bird 1 here, because it's got a low resistance, will be as high as 156 milliamps, which will smash it to pieces. Kentucky Fried Chicken. This end, 62 milliamps, it won't be stunned. So the problem the industry's got is that, to make sure this bird was stunned, you'd have to give that bird an awful lot of current. So it doesn't happen in practice. You can't really meet the requirements of the regulation that every bird should be given enough current so that it's stunned. So can we do anything else? Well, okay. Some work done by Jeff Lyons and group. They looked at a way of supporting the birds, because one of the problems with stunning poultry is that if you invert them, they don't like it. They've got a diaphragm, so the viscera compresses the heart and lungs. This supports them on an inclined conveyor, and they've got loose-fitting shackles, so that you can then drop them into a water bath that perhaps works in a different way, maybe passing current through the water rather than through the whole bird, because in that way, you could apply higher currents without doing the damage to the muscle. Ooh, there's a lot going on here. I hope some of you are still with me. So we can come out with the requirements in terms of values. Research has demonstrated that. And some of this have been put into practice this is a commercial video, so I apologise for the music and the commentary, but it's worth a look.
Topkip is specialized in developing innovations in the poultry meat industry. Optimizing of the slaughtering process starts right at the beginning of the slaughtering line when the chickens are being stunned. Topkip developed the Volta, a machine whose workings are based on an individual and animal-friendly stunning procedure. The shackled chickens are collected into cones. This ensures that they are in the correct position for stunning. Wing flapping won't be possible, so there is a minimum of bone breakage. Directly after the cone positioning, 2 electrode plates close in on the head and measure each chicken's individual head resistance. An advanced computer-controlled system is the central component of the machine. Within a fraction of a second, the necessary current is determined, and through the same electrode plates, the current is administered to the head. This ensures...
Okay, I won't run all of it. Needless to say, it's got a few problems. That was a promotional video. Whether the current's turned on soon enough after the plates are applied to the head, and not all birds' heads will be in the right place. But it's a really good move forward. It's got real potential and should be encouraged. Another alternative is perhaps the use of gas. Perhaps CO2 systems have been in for a long time for pigs, but the way that it's developed for poultry is that research has been done first before the systems were developed. And this system is one where the birds are lowered in their transport drawers very gradually into a raising concentration of CO2. And there seems to be some protection process of a gradually increasing concentration of CO2, and they don't seem to go through that aversiveness that you see with higher concentrations. So these sort of systems seem to be a lot better from a welfare point of view. And in the States, they put them into chambers in one plant and then suck the air out. And this is another approach, low atmosphere pressure stunning, which has got some real potentials. And some research is going on to see whether this is as welfare friendly as we think it might be. Whether you could apply this sort of system for other species is very interesting, particularly, say, with pigs, where we at the University of Bristol have put a proposal together, headed by a colleague from Silso, ex-Silso Research Institute, looking at developing this low atmosphere pressure stunning system for pigs, because we all know there are problems with high concentrations of CO2. Now, the systems that have been developed for high concentration systems for pigs are very welfare friendly. And the development of these systems for handling pigs in small groups, separating them out, and then moving them using gates into the stunning unit is fantastic. But if we can combine that with a better gas system, it would be even better. So that's the way the thinking's sort of going, or my thinking's going. I said I'd briefly finish with a little bit about this. Very difficult area, very difficult to promote, and John's been through a bit of a problem with this, as have various other people. Just to raise a few issues. Three important questions from a scientific point of view is the restraint stressful, more stressful than normal restraint of animals prior to slaughter? Is the cut painful? And how long do they take to die? And if you look at the regulations, if you look at WATOT, Welfare of Animals at the Time of Killing Regs, 2014, the latest one that comes in parallel with a new legislation from Brussels, animals should be individually restrained in an upright position in a restraining pen. So they're saying we can't tip them over. That's good news. Is the cut painful? Well, research in New Zealand, sponsored by DEFRA, using EEG spectral analysis has shown that slaughter is painful. We've known it's been painful for a long time. It's just difficult to demonstrate pain. And so most people would agree with that, although the religious groups are not happy with that. And of course, we've got this problem of false aneurysms. As soon as you cut an artery, the carotid artery in the neck, then you can get them blowing up into sort of balloons or false aneurysms, and the blood can clot quickly, occlude blood loss through there, and you get continued supply to the vertebral artery in cattle, which can result in maintaining blood pressure to the brain for quite some periods, which accounts for the fact that some animals will go down initially and then get up again after about half a minute or so, and then start wandering around the abattoir with a complete cut. So a very dangerous situation. If you see here what happens to arterial blood pressure if you carry out a chest stick, cutting the major blood vessels close to the heart, blood pressures drop very quickly, you get no problems. The problem is when you make this cut across the neck. How long do they take to die? Well, in terms of loss of posture, final collapse, which is used within the regulations to assess what's going on, it can be longer than a minute. So we've got to do something about this. It is a problem. We need to really think out ways of getting around this problem. So I mentioned animal welfare officers. It's something that we've been doing. We've been running courses from the University of Bristol since 1993. It's been adopted into EU Regulation 1099/2009 as a requirement for all abattoirs above a certain throughput to have trained animal welfare officers, well, not trained, have an animal welfare officer on site to carry out various procedures and to maintain standard operating procedures, etc. And those courses are continuing, evolving to take in new regulations, new scientific research results, and any other equipment things that develop in the industry. It breaks down, the animal welfare officer course breaks down that sort of menu, 2-day course, residential, accredited through Turning Point. We assess the ability of the delegates to take on board the information. And it's a 3-year lasting certificate they have to refresh after 3 years. We also run official veterinarian training courses at Bristol. The other courses run at Glasgow, and there we have a 3-week, very intensive course where we're trying to bring them up to speed on everything to do with veterinary public health. So the red light's on. I've finished, John. That'll do.
Thank you very much, Steve. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I think that was quite insightful, and particularly towards the end there, for me, just reaffirms the position that BVA have taken on this. It's absolutely right for animal welfare. So, questions from the audience. We've got about 20 minutes. Who would like to ask the first question? Bradley.
Hi, Bradley Viner, Junior Vice President, Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons. I'd just like to ask about species differences and your views with non-stun slaughter, because it seems to me there's been a focus on bovines where the downside is very clear. We know the anatomy is different in sheep, and you seem to have thrown doubts upon the large-scale system in use for many poultry. So what are your views on non-stun slaughter in non-bovines?
Yeah, good question. There's one or two problems with, say, ovines with sheep insofar as that the legislation requires the animals to be held in restraint individually before religious slaughter. And that's been demonstrated to be a problem. We all know that sheep like to be together. So if you're putting them in V-restraint, for example, it's better to put one after the other and then deal with the first one. So there's a 20-second rule whereby you've got to hold the animal in V-restraint for 20 seconds after the cut's made, and then before you can put another one in. So that makes a bit of a difference. I think it was originally introduced to try and slow throughput down, politically rather than from any science-based requirement. But sheep still take some time to lose consciousness. So it's not instantaneous, whatever the religious groups tell you. They're going to take 6-7 seconds at least to lose consciousness following a transverse cut across the neck, which will be painful. So From my point of view, having worked on stunning systems for a long time, I find it very difficult to listen to those arguments. And I am yet to be convinced that slaughter without stunning is not painful. So I think that sheep are very likely, because they're a prey species, they're very likely to cover up any response, that you're not going to see much of a reaction. But if you measure any sort of indicators of stress, they're highly stressed at that point, and I think that would be your answer. Other species, same sort of problem. The problem with cattle is obvious, and deer, because of the vertebral arteries supply to the brain, which isn't there in other species. But you are still carrying out, cutting all the soft tissues ventral to the spine is a massive trauma. And in a conscious animal? Sorry? Yeah, I think the same situation with poultry. I think that poultry, again, will take some time to lose consciousness following a neck cut. And the process is done at speed, and individual assessment's difficult. So I think that, again, in an ideal world, I think animals would be stunned before slaughter. Our problem is that we're dealing with religious groups, and unfortunately their requirements are that they're not stunned.
Although, of course, we do recognise that 80% of them are within the halal sector.
Yes, absolutely.
For that. I was just interested on poultry. It's a long time since I did my physics A-level, but there seems to be quite a variation in the resistance per bird. And when you think that broiler production produces quite a standardised sort of unit coming out, is that just the way it is, or is there a reason for that?
No. The reason for that is the junction between the legs and the shackle. The electrical connection between the bird and the shackle is a requirement for the current to flow from the live water through the bird to earth. And to make that connection is very difficult to cut out the variation in electrical resistance between the leg and the shackle. Lots of reasons, lots of reasons. And that's where most of the variation is. So, for instance, if you electrically stun broilers on a line, and you want to deliver 1.3, 1.8 amps, it's a good example of a video I've got, you require something like 160 volts. To do the same thing with hens on the same line with the same current, you need 380 volts. And the difference is because the hen's leg is very dry, very scaly, just sits at the bottom of the shackle, and you don't get any connections through the leg at all.
So it's the contact point.
It's contact point, yeah.
Hydration of the
and they really can't do very much about that.
No. Another question here in the front.
My name's Hannah Jordan, and I work for the Office of Lord Trees. At the OIE conference, or the OIE general session a couple of weeks ago, there was a resolution laid before the group to remove the necessity in the terrestrial code to sort poultry sizes to address this potential non-stunning, so sort the bigger birds from the smaller birds. I wondered what your thoughts on that would be as a way of doing it. The Americans are very keen for it not to happen at all, unsurprisingly, but I wondered if that would help in any way at all, or was it unnecessary?
Okay, yeah. I think that the way around it would be to perhaps use the inclined conveyor to support at least 3/4 of the way to the bird rather than on the shackle. Use a loose-fitting shackle. If you're then dropping them into a water bath, you could have it constant current. And that design has been around for 15 years and has been published for 15 years. None of the equipment manufacturers have ever taken it up, even though researchers have been banging on their doors trying to make them. And to do that, you just insulate every bird on the line from every other bird by using plastic chain. And then you approach a water bath, you make the earth bit, the shackle, electrically live and the water earth, and you control the voltage to individual birds based on the resistance, and you do that electronically. So it's a simple way out, but it's never been developed further. So I think the difference between big legs, small legs, you're going to get anyway, even if you sort out the birds. It's not a question of the resistance through the birds that's the problem. the resistance variation is the leg shackle.
Presumably, though, the through bird stunning is more likely to result in cardiac arrest than head-only stunning, which is why that top kip system looks so attractive.
Yeah. If you go if you wanted to carry out halal, for instance, where you want to ensure that every bird can recover, then to do that, you've got to go to high frequencies. Now, the research that was carried out at Bristol by colleagues of mine suggested that up to 800 hertz was acceptable, but at higher frequencies, you need more current to stun. So for 600 to 800 hertz, the recommendation was for 200 milliamps per bird. And above that frequency, they suggested it wasn't practical. What happened was that the legislation came out allowing you to go up to 1500 hertz at 200 milliamps per bird, which doesn't really match the research. And so what the religious groups do, particularly halal, well, they'll go to 1500 hertz because they've got more chance of keeping the birds alive at that higher frequency because the heart's more susceptible to low frequency and will survive. So the birds will, but at 1500 hertz, at 200 milliamps per bird, I would suggest that quite a few birds won't be stunned. Yeah. And you've got the variation in resistance. So it's not a very good system. The gas systems that we've got now, the birds arrive in the transport containers, there's no ante-mortem handling at all, there's no inversion, there's no shackling, there's no conveying on the lines, there's no pre-stun shocks in water baths. They just take the drawers of the birds and lower them gently into the gas.
But that's a gas kill?
Yeah, it's a kill.
Yeah.
You can't use it for halal.
Okay, a couple of hands going up. Stephen?
Thank you. My question will take us off a little bit at a tangent, but I hope you'll bear with me. It's about 15 years since the last major foot and mouth disease outbreak, and I was sitting on preliminary investigation committee at the time, and a significant number of complaints came in about slaughter on farm, particularly of small lambs and small piglets. I wondered if there's been any change since that time, or whether you hold out any hope for a better method of slaughter in those sort of circumstances.
Yes, I think there has been change in the development of new guns, and these new percussive guns are specifically designed for neonates. So I'm carrying out a project at the moment with Charlie from the HSA and others, and we're looking at the use of one of these guns on neonate piglets, lambs and kids, and assessing the effectiveness of their use. So I think that we'll have an answer to that question very soon, and I think that some of these guns, perhaps the American ones, very portable, very cheap to use, have got a real answer to perhaps some of the older methods where you'd swing the animal against the floor or a wall. So yes, I think there are some answers there.
Gentleman next to Stephen, just ease with the mic.
Hi, David Pritchard. Thank you, Steve, for an excellent talk. But perhaps I just comment on the issue of young lambs. It is young lambs and piglets. It is a major issue, but as well as the percussion devices, one can also use the containerized gassing systems, which IDEFRA now has available and has been widely used in action with the recent chickens and flu cases we've had. Can I just ask you to comment on the general? It was a comprehensive talk. There's one little bit that you didn't cover, which was the issues there are in relation to gas mixtures, especially with poultry and pigs in relation to their aversiveness, because I think that's quite an important issue. That clearly the issue with the chickens is that a water bath stunning isn't acceptable, but the gas stunning also has some issues as well.
Okay. Yeah, I think that the use of gas, particularly the use of CO2, the problem with some of the other gas mixtures that have been tried, for instance, the use of anoxic gas mixtures, where you're using inert gases, well, respiratory inert gases like nitrogen or or others, I think, is that those gases where you're simply replacing oxygen in the atmosphere that you're exposing the birds to down to a very low level, to 2% or lower, will result in anoxic convulsions. And if you expose birds to anoxic convulsions, then some of the birds are going to be still conscious when other birds are convulsing in a group, in a transport tray, and therefore there's an issue there in terms of welfare. There's also an issue in terms of wing damage with birds that go through anoxic convulsions, so they haven't really been very popular with the industry. So we were left with very little alternative until the legislation was amended back along prior to the new EC regulation coming in, so that the industry was allowed to use some of the new gas mixtures, and there are basically 4 gas mixtures that are available to them now. They still haven't really gripped or gone with anoxic ones because of convulsions. CO2 is an anticonvulsant gas because it works on the spinal cord as well as the brain at the same time, and you don't get convulsions to the same degree, which is why the industry likes it. The systems, we believe, that expose birds gradually to an increasing level of CO2 have major advantages, we think, in terms of the aversiveness of the exposure. We're not sure why. We've got a PhD student who is about to start to look at that. And so we'll be exploring, what is the mechanism behind that. But it's obviously, from an industry point of view, it looks to be pretty good. And in terms of quality, the quality that it produces is also pretty good. So even if there is aversion there, which there doesn't appear to be, and we've studied it, not in terms of brain activity, we've studied it from an animal behavior point of view. Even if there is some aversion there, the whole holistic approach is so much better than electrical water bath stunning. So, I think we've got to go down that route with large numbers of birds. You've got to think of the problems after that. If you're going to kill them all in a gas, you've got to get them out of the gas, you've got to bleed them, you've then got to get them into the skull tank so that you can get the feathers off. And if they're getting too cold, by the time they get into the skulls, you can't get the feathers off. And it's not just one thing you've got to think of. You've got to make sure that everything's joined up, as you're well aware, David. So, we're looking at, hopefully, all aspects of this, and we'll come up with something that maybe will work.
Good. Thank you. Amelia,
Could you comment on the labelling of meat and whether and when supermarkets are going to start labelling non-stunned versus stunned meat?
No. I don't know. Do you know, John?
Well, no. I mean, the EFSA report, which we looked at late last week, which came out, which has asked that question and got very little sort of engagement until members of the public were actually prompted to say were they actually interested in having that information on the label. And in fact, 72% of them showed some interest to quite a lot of interest. But at the moment, that's just come out, so it will be something that we will be carrying on to try and push forward and to try and engage with the retailers to drive that informed choice. If we end up in a situation whereby it is allowed under the derogation, then we need to be clear that that meat should only be consumed by the people that require it and not end up on the general market as unlabelled product. Because I don't want to eat it. So, the back.
Josie Rafferty, MacArthur, Barstow and Gibbs practice. I just wanted comments from both Steve and the audience on sort of monitoring in slaughterhouses. It's all very well having all these rules and regulations, but I think we all know that they're not adhered to from secret filming that's happened, and also my own personal experience as a vet student of going into slaughterhouses. The stunning process isn't done properly. Animals are getting very stressed. They're kicked around. They're not treated as they properly should be. and it's all very well having the regulations, but how are we going to monitor them, and what are we going to do about the people that don't stick to them?
You're very sceptical, aren't you? If you go back to 2006, then the hygiene regulations were changed, and they brought in HACCP. And HACCP was designed to try and ensure that the food was safe for people to eat. Now, you may argue that it's worked or it's not. But what they did was they took away the responsibility from the OV, and they gave it to the food business operator. And it was then his responsibility to employ HACCP to make sure that the food was safe, and the OV would then audit. Okay? Now, this new regulation, 2012-2013, from Europe, is doing exactly the same for welfare. So what it's doing, it's saying, right, the responsibility is no longer with the OV, the responsibility is with the food business operator, and they will maintain welfare in the same way, if you like, a welfare HACCP, but they will have an animal welfare officer who will have responsibilities outlined in the legislation, including what he has to monitor and how he has to report it, also including that he must include standard operating procedures for anything that involves live animals. So everything's got to be documented. And I would suggest that this is a much, much better way of doing things. And the OV will then audit welfare. So I think that, we can have a very sceptical view of the way that abattoirs operate. And it is very difficult, I would agree, to motivate abattoir staff to maintain good welfare, because it is a pretty awful job. And therefore, to do that is difficult. But the new regulation, with WATOC in place as well, has got some real benefits going for it, I think. And I think it's going to take out a lot of the variation that you've seen, I would hope, and ensure that animals are monitored and stunning is understood in a bit more detail.
Good, thanks, Steve.
Sorry, I can't hear.
So the question is, do you envisage seeing CCTV more used in slaughterhouses?
Yeah, I think that the disadvantage with CCTV is how do you analyse it? Because it's real time. So if you may as well be there and observe if you're going to do every animal. So how do you do it? Well, there's a company in the States that actually stream video from all their plants into a central hub, and they employ people to assess it based on risk. So they'll work out the risk of certain plants obviously having bad welfare, and they'll look at their data in more detail than other plants that have got a lesser risk. And that seems a good way of doing it. But the real benefit from it is not so much for the auditor coming in saying, I want to see last Tuesdays at 4:30 in the afternoon sort of thing and see a few animals, is that you can use it for troubleshooting. If you do see, if the slaughterman does have a problem with an animal that shows signs of recovery during bleeding or wasn't stunned very effectively, they can then look it up. They can go back and look at that animal. How much current did it get? Was it applied in the right place? So there are things that can be done. The animal welfare officer can do that. That's what happens in the abattoir we have at Bristol.
I think we recognise as well that a lot of the larger plants do actually have CCTV already in operation, but purely for that sort of retrospective analysis and training. I think the training is a real win. Yeah. And of course that's in there because the retailers are, insisting on it. So because in plant, it's very, very difficult to gain unobserved access to the points that really matter. And that's not only the stunning box, that's the lairage as well. Yeah, so absolutely. From start to finish. Kate, you had a question, and then I'll come back to Lewis Grant, who's going to answer.
Kate Hovers, the regional rep for South Wales. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I've actually got a question about fish, which I don't really know much about, but I gather there is some stunning of fish pre-slaughter and some not, and the regulations are different, and it's nothing to do with religious slaughter. But as a fish eater, I'd be quite interested.
If you're interested in the welfare of fish at slaughter, there's been a very recent Falk report on that. That just gives you a lot of information. But yes, there is stunning systems developed for fish. For instance, for salmon, there's a percussive device, very, very similar to the device used for poultry. In fact, the gun that I showed you very early on in my presentation for poultry was originally developed for salmon. And the salmon are harvested and they're placed in channels and where they're really guided through and into an end where the blow's delivered, and that kills them, and then they're bled by cutting the gill rakers. They're looking to develop systems where the fish would swim up streams of water into position, so that's a bit more self-regulating, if you like. They would choose the way to go. But in terms of salmon, I think the systems are pretty good. In terms of electrical systems, there are a number of electrical systems around, again, which either you're going to do it in a pipe, when you're pumping fish through a pipe, so you have two electrodes either side within the pipe, delivers current through the water, and then they come out onto ice or air in a stunned state and they don't recover. It's very difficult to actually induce cardiac arrest in fish. Ventricular fibrillation really doesn't work. So you have to really zap them a bit. And other methods are in tanks. So there are systems that have been developed for fish, and more research is going on in that area now, because I think the welfare of fish has been recognised, and they've been recognised as sentient beings. So hopefully it'll be developed further.
We actually visited a plant in Scotland 18 months ago, and whilst it wasn't operational on the day, we saw the degree of mechanisation for the whole process, which was, quite inspiring. And whilst we hear about turkeys voting for Christmas, I've not really come across salmon voting for slaughter, but it sounds as if it's going to be the way it's going to go. Lewis, you had a comment on CCTV, I think.
Yes, Lewis Grant, VPHA. I'm very interested in the creation of animal welfare officers, and I think this is an opportunity for the industry to actually make things a bit better. Now, you did say, Steve, and I do agree with you, it's maybe not easy working in a slaughterhouse, but when you go on the animal welfare officer course, I would hope it's an opportunity to win some of these people over. And I'm looking particularly at when you have some of the underground photography that's been going on, etc., animal aid and what have you, that a lot of the problems stem from handling the actual animals as they're approaching slaughter, not even slaughter itself. There are two issues, basically, the method of slaughter, or indeed how do you get the animal to the point of slaughter. And there are simple systems, and I'm now looking not at big factories, at medium-sized places where they could make it so much better by even just thinking about simple things like gates and how do you reduce the pen and you don't land up chasing the animals around. If you have a group situation, you're down to the last 2 or 3, that's when they get stressed, they start jumping around. If the animal welfare officer could get into his head, there is an easier way, can I go back to my actual factory and try and help that situation? That's basically, I don't know what your view is on that.
Yeah, I thoroughly agree. It tends to be the last place that the management actually look at when they get everything else right. Oh, perhaps we'll do something about the handling system in the lairage or arrival. But the new regulation requires certificates of competence for all personnel or handling staff, which is a good move. But before it was just slaughtermen. Now it's people working, the operatives working the lairage as well. So they've got to have a degree of training, and they've got to have a certain amount of knowledge. And some of these guys are very experienced handlers, and the amount of information that's held in their head is unbelievable. They know, just by the way animals handled, which farm they've come from. And they know, which animals are difficult and which are not. And why aren't we using that information? It's so valuable to actually go back to the farm and work out what's going on the farm. So yes, very, very important. And some of the systems that we train through the Animal Welfare Officer course is all about animal behaviour, animal handling, and how they can improve it, because it makes a huge difference to product quality. If nothing else, you've got to run a business. If you're not making any profit, you're not going to stay in business. So animal welfare is so important for that alone.
I think that really sort of, rams the point home that there's a lot of food chain information out there that we don't actually get back to feed the producer and the whole sort of system, really. So it's a point well made.
One other point I'd like to make is that these animal welfare officers is a senior position. and it should be recognised as such. We've got at least one here that I know of who's an animal welfare officer in a senior position. And one of the people we're asked who's got the best qualifications to become an animal welfare officer, and the answer is an OV. And the reason why the OV should consider it is because, one, they'd have more influence over what goes on in the factory, and two, they get paid a lot more money.
Good, excellent. I think that's a really good point and a good moment in time to round it up and talking about food. Food will be served in the Great Hall where you had coffee, and we would like you back at 1:45 prompt, please. But I would like you to show your appreciation for what has been an excellent morning. Thank you.